So today we're just gonna be making sourdough with this organic bread flour from Central Milling. We've got a starter here and a bowl, a scale, water, and some salt. To help me remember sort of the right measurements for everything, I think 1, 4, 5, 10. So just remember 1, 4, 5, 10. That's 100 grams of your starter, 400 grams of water, and then 500 grams of your flour, and 10 grams of salt. And I've got my starter here that I fed last night. Now, normally I feed my starter with this bread flour. I ran out of that yesterday, so I just used whatever I had, which I think was like another more whole grain bread flour. So this is gonna be like a little bit thicker than than the normal flour. But when you're baking at home, you just wanna like use what you have, right? So we're just all about making this a little bit more convenient for you at home. So I'm gonna measure out 100 grams of my starter here. I got a little extra, 133, which is fine. We can work with that. So we're landing at 128. When you're baking at home, it's not that serious. So just go with what you've got. You can always adjust along the way. The 1, 4, 5, 10 measurements, like those are just guidelines. So you might, if you're using, a whiter flour, more sifted flour, you might opt for a little bit less water and a less hydrated dough, just because that might be easier for you to work with. Just do what makes sense for you. I'm gonna add in my 400 grams of water. Hopefully I got a big enough bowl. Now you want to measure your salt out separately. Don't try to measure it in this bowl because you're measuring more heavyweight items to a super lightweight item, and it's very easy to over salt your loaf. So I'm going to get this right in here, kind of so it dissolves a bit. 500 grams of flour. And I also wanted to do this with my hand. I personally love baking sourdough with my hand. I just think it's like a more intimate experience. You get to know your dough a lot better. You know what? This is gonna take forever, so I'm just gonna pour it in. And especially when you're first starting to bake sourdough, I think it's so important to just really get in there, because John and I talk about this a lot, where we started baking, hand mixing everything. We didn't have fancy tools. We had 0 mixers. I don't think we got a mixer until it was like a year in. Everything we were making was by hand. And I think that experience was super valuable for us to get to know the essence of, our products that we're making. Okay, so I can move this scale out of the way. I won't need that anymore. And here we go. We're just gonna dive right in. When I'm mixing here, I'm just sort of scraping the side of the bowl and squishing it all together in the center, just really gently at first so I don't get too messy. And you really just want to get it to combine first of all. So you don't want any flour clumps in here. I also have a handy dandy bench scraper, or bowl scraper, so that at the end we can keep our bowl nice and clean. But yes, like I said, there's also something really grounding about this. I don't know, I watch my kids, Kira really loves slime, and all parents are grossed out by slime. And I came to realize what is this? This is basically slime, but it's edible. So when I'm baking at home, I typically like to make a few recipes at once. So I refreshed my starter last night, 150 grams and then of starter, 300 grams of flour, and 300 grams of water. And I just kind of let that sit for about 3 hours till I saw some activity, maybe 4 or 5 hours actually, till I saw some activity, and then I stuck it in the fridge so that I could sleep between now and then. So my dough is still going to be really sticky, and now that it's sort of come together, I'm just sort of testing you know, this gluten structure. So I'm wanting it to be more stuck together. So I'm gonna still knead this. You see right now it's like sort of breaking apart. That means I should still keep going. Also, another hot tip is to like keep a bowl of water nearby. I love to have that nearby, especially when I'm folding my dough. It just helps keep you clean and your bowl clean, and helps the dough not to stick to you as much. And I don't know about you, but I think hydration is really important, like for just you as a human being. And so why wouldn't it be as important for these like cellular structures in here? So we're just gonna keep mixing this until we get the consistency that we want. And I wanted to do this, like, not only do I prefer to mix sourdough this way, but I also wanted to illuminate that, like, you don't need fancy stuff. You don't need a fancy mixer to feed your family well. Like, you just need some basic things: a bowl, some flour, water, salt, things that you should already probably have in your pantry. So now you can see it's sort of starting to stick together more. As I scrape the side of the bowl and pull it up, it's retaining more of its structure. So the first mix, just know the first mix, the initial mix, this one, is going to be sticky, and that's okay. We are working with a pretty hydrated dough, so like I said, use that 1, 4, 5, 10 as a guide, not necessarily as like the Bible for sourdough. It is just like, these are the general weights that you want to stick with. So if you know you're working with like a more sifted or whiter flour and you're new to sourdough baking, maybe reduce that hydration to more like 375, 350. You can always add more water versus take it away, but you can also, if you added too much water, you can add a little more flour too. Like, it's just baking, it's not that serious. I'm so used to baking at huge scale that baking at home felt a little bit foreign to me. But now that I've started, I love it. And I tell everybody who asks, especially, you know, you have a bakery, it's gotten popular, you know, how did you know you love baking? And truthfully, when we started Proof, I hated baking. And I wasn't even a big fan of sourdough. I grew up eating pita bread and not really understanding this like European style of bread. And furthermore, I didn't like sourdough because I was just, the only sourdough that I'd been exposed to is like the sourdough in the store, which is not real sourdough, you know? So it's just flavored with acid. And if you look at the ingredients, it's still junk. I mean, I'm sure you can find some better options, but yeah, so I tell people all the time, because we get customers that are, you know, that are not really into sourdough, and I always tell them, like, neither was I. It's because we were told a lie all this time. That's not real sourdough. This long fermentation process, working with the elements of nature, this is what it's all about. Okay, so you can see, as I stick my hand in here, I'm sticking it in, going kind of under and pulling it up, and you can see it's starting to stay together a little bit better. So I'm just gonna mix this just a little bit more. And I'm using this water here as just like a dipping for my hands so that I get this result without tearing the dough. So it does take a minute, especially with like a wetter dough. I think I added, because we added a little extra starter and I had a little bit extra water. This one's a pretty wet one. And just know, like, the first few times that you make sourdough, it's gonna stick really bad to your hands. Doesn't mean that you suck, it just means that you gotta keep going. You are working with a living thing, right? Well, you have to like get used to each other. You don't just like go meet a new person and then invite them like to, you know, do something super intimate together, right? This is like an intimate process. So you just need a minute to sort of understand each other, your sourdough starter and you, and then the sourdough starter, how it interacts with everything else that you're working with. I'm getting it to a point where I'm pretty much liking this. So I am just gonna do this a few more times and sort of take it to its edges. And that's it. We'll just leave it like this for now. I'm gonna use my bowl scraper and just scrape this stuff together. We don't want to waste anything. And as I'm doing this, I'm also sort of like still kind of stretching it into itself, making sure that all the bits are in there and they're all going to get absorbed in this initial fermentation process. Okay, so now that I have this done, I'm just going to cover this bowl. I'm going to wash my hands, I'm going to cover this bowl and then set it aside. And I'm going to set it aside and do something else. So usually at this point, I'll make another recipe and then I'll refresh my starter, because what I realized last night was that if you refresh your starter around the same time as you mix your dough, you start to and you set it out on the counter, you can sort of use this as like a gauge for your fermentation process. So as this starter is building, you know what's happening sort of in your dough. This is going to move a little bit faster than your dough will move, but it is still a great gauge for, you know, it's like nature's timer for what you're doing. All right. And I'm pretty happy with that. Still sticking to the bowl quite a bit, so that I don't love. And at this phase, it's going to be a little bit shaggy, right? We have the benefit of time on our side, and you'll notice as time progresses today, this dough is going to get smoother. It's like always shocking in a good way. But even now, as I'm sort of cleaning my bowl here with my cleaner bench scraper or my bowl scraper, you can notice like it's sticking to the scraper, but it's also not like stuck to the scraper. So it's sticking to the scraper, but I can move it and like drop it back in on itself, and it's sticking more to itself. Okay, I'm gonna cover this and set it aside and let time work its magic. This is the sourdough that we mixed. So you'll notice it's still pretty shaggy, still pretty soupy, but I'm gonna use this moment to just quickly fold it. So I'm dipping my hands in my little bit of water here. And I'm just gonna come underneath and pull it up and over. And the water helps it so it doesn't stick to my hands. I get a little less messy. And you'll notice over time, so it has a lot of extensibility, but as I keep going around, I'm just coming in under, pulling it up, and just around a little bit. Under, up, around. You'll notice it's starting to get a little bit tighter. I can't stretch it as far. I think this is probably one of my favorite parts about making sourdough, is the folding part. I don't know what it is. It's just so satisfying. So I'm just going to do that a couple of times on this round until I feel like, yeah. So when you're doing this by hand, I mix this by hand. You really want to focus on this gluten development. This is what's happening right here, is we're strengthening the dough through this process. We're also gauging where it's at while we do this. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Cover it back up and leave it for another 30 minutes. Set it aside for another 30 minutes. Okay, so we're on the second fold, and you'll notice it's still pretty soupy. So normally my process is 3 folds. Considering how hydrated this dough is, and the fact that I had a weird kind of like starter situation where it was a whole grain starter instead of the typical, you know, sifted bread flour that I use, I might opt to do a 4th because I'm not really getting yet the consistency that I want, but you know, you never know, you could be surprised. So in this set of folds, I'm actually gonna try to focus on actually lifting this out of the bowl and letting gravity do some of the stretching for me. So I'm just getting my hand a little bit wet, kind of coming under here and just pulling it off the bowl. And you can be, you know, be gentle but firm. I don't know. So I'm trying to use like some momentum to get it to tuck under itself here. And now we have like a nice little ball. You just want to, when you're doing this process, you want to be careful not to like really like get your fingers in there. You want to think about like making your hands like scoops. So when you get under here, you keep your fingers together and you just let it dangle. And then you use the bowl, like I'm using the bowl when I come back down to tuck it under itself. So I'm sticking it on one side and rolling it over. And that's that. So that is our second fold, and we'll see where it lands in 30 minutes from now when we do our third fold, and we'll decide from there if we're gonna add a fourth. It's been about 45 minutes since our last fold, so we're gonna take a peek and see how our sourdough is doing. Okay, it's been about 45 minutes, and this is what our dough looks like. We're seeing a lot of bubbles, so that's good. We're seeing activity. It's still looking a little soupy. It is going to be a high hydration recipe. So if you have sifted flour at home, if you're a new baker, lower your hydration a little bit. I just like the 1, 4, 5, 10 because for me, it's really easy to remember and I don't have to keep peeking at a recipe. It's a lot faster too, you know, when you have it memorized. So I'm just going to keep folding this. We'll probably add one more session of folding just to see where we can get this to. Like I had a little feeling that this would be kind of a weirder mix just because like yesterday I had to refresh with a different flour. A more whole grain flour. So it has changed my ratios a bit. I think if I were just running on gut, I might have added a little bit more flour, but I didn't want to confuse anybody. So we're going with the straight 1, 4, 5 about, and the 10 grams of salt. So let's fold this and see where we land. Albeit, it is a very nice stretchy dough. I like to see this. It's a strong dough. I can pull it really far and still it's not ripping or tearing or anything. I think if we get one more fold in here, it'll still be manageable. And I got rid of my bowl of water, but it is helpful, again, to have a bowl of water nearby, especially if you're new to handling sourdough, especially a sticky dough like this one. Okay, so we'll feel it. It's kind of nice because like now that we folded it, it's retaining its shape a little bit better, but I bet the next time we look at it, it's still gonna look like soup. But we'll take a peek in 30 more minutes. I made a loaf yesterday in preparation for, you know, preparing my starter and everything for talking about stuff today, and we're gonna learn about what can go wrong because something is going wrong. So I made this dough yesterday. It is with a whole grain starter and whole grain flour. And when you use whole grains, things will move a lot faster, you'll notice. And so this has moved quite a bit. So yesterday I had this, John was right. I was thinking it was gonna need more time and he was like, go put that in the fridge right now. And so this has been, I mixed this up last night around 6 p.m. and let it sit on the counter, and I put it in the fridge probably around 10 p.m. and it is bursting out of here. I probably should have split it in half, but I didn't. So we're gonna talk about how to score maybe a overproof loaf, which is what you're experiencing, what I'm experiencing. Definitely know it's gone too far when it's sticking to other things, right? The thing about sourdough, like what I've noticed is when it's sticking to itself, you're in the good fermentation zone. When it starts to stick to other things, like your hands, the table, cloth, it's probably gone too far. So because this is a pretty overproof loaf, I'm not gonna score like I normally do. It's still cold, but I'm not gonna like go hardcore deep. When it's like this, I'm gonna treat it really gently. It's an elderly loaf at this point. So I do enjoy doing the fancy stuff, right, and practicing at home when I have more time to do intricate designs. But since I don't feel like this loaf has, you know, everything that it needs to handle that today. So we're just gonna keep it into one functional score. So just a quick little shallow. I'm more focused on the angle here than I am getting deep in there. This is all I'm gonna do to it. And this is all you have to do to it. So, and you don't even have to do this if you don't want to, but we recommend doing a functional score so you can sort of control the burst in your loaf. Like there's still energy in here, and you can either let it do its own thing and come out with like a Frankenstein loaf, or you can kind of try to coach it into the right position. So let me go get our Dutch oven. So my Dutch oven has been in the oven at 450 for a few minutes. Not a few minutes, like 30 minutes, because you want everything around your loaf to be warm. So I'm just gonna grab the corners of my paper, actually the sides, and just flop it in here. When you use the paper, it's just expect that you're gonna get like little wrinkles in your dough. Also, this was a really big dough. I think I landed at like 900 grams or something. So, and we're gonna try to do this as quick as possible and put it back in the oven. And I'm gonna set a timer for 20 minutes for this first covered bake. That's that. So this is my fourth fold on this dough, and it's looking like this is what I'm working with. So it's gonna be a pretty wet dough. Might be a little bit challenging for newbies to work on, but like I said, adjust your recipe as you're mixing. So I should have just gone with my gut and added that little extra dust of flour. I could try to add it now, but I'm just gonna go with what I have. It's just bread, it's not that serious. And I'm still getting like some good activity out of it. So I'm just going to keep folding it until I almost like flip it over. There's so many ways to fold your dough and build this gluten. There's slap and fold. You know, there's what I'm doing where you're pulling it up from the bottom and folding it in on itself. And then there's also, you know, what I prefer to do with larger batches of dough, which is going underneath and letting gravity do its thing. So just gonna do that. And we're gonna set it aside for about an hour, let it rest, really come together. And we'll shape it and put it in the fridge overnight. Okay, so we've done 4 folds. I don't think it's gonna get any better. So we're gonna just like use a little bit of flour on the table while we shape, and it'll hopefully absorb some of that and help retain some of its structure. But we're gonna end up with a really nice open loaf here. I'm just using a little bit of water in my hands to get this out of the bowl. One last sort of tension project. See, and it's sticking to the bowl again more than myself, so I may have actually pushed it with that 4th fold. I'm just gonna put a little flour here, and I'm gonna split this one into 2. So we're gonna do a round loaf and a sourdough traditional, like batard, I think they call it. So from here, I could choose to pre-shape it and set it aside, and I think maybe that's what we'll do because that might help us also create more tension. So the way I'm doing this is I am just flouring my hands and kind of just going around the loaf really gently, tucking it under itself. And I'm just making it into a circle. And actually, this is the same way that you shape a loaf into a more of a miche, like a circular style. And I'm gonna actually use that instead because I'm impatient, like I said. So this is just a random little wicker basket. This is what I'm gonna use to house my loaf overnight. Remember, it may expand in there, so you wanna leave a little bit of space for that. And when you put your loaf in here, you're gonna put it with the seam side up. Because when you take it out in the morning to bake it, it's gonna be seam side down. So I'm just gonna wrap that baby up, stick it in the fridge. This little bit of dough here that I have left, I'm just gonna turn this into a little bit, like a little tiny loaf, and we'll just use this little chip basket. So for this, I'm just gonna flip it over. We'll do like a shaping. So I want my shape to start as kind of a square or a rectangle. I'm gonna grab the corners and fold them in. Grab the other corner, the center, fold it in. We're just folding it in, like kind of like shoelacing it up. And then from the front. So you want to be really like quick with your movements, especially when you have a sticky dough. So I'm not even pushing on the dough, I'm not grabbing it, I'm just like letting it stick to me. So I'm gonna roll it down, just put it on itself, and we're just gonna do that the whole way. I'm just pulling it down. It's a little sticky, I probably needed more flour. And that's that. It's a little baby loaf. The 1, 4, 5, 10 is really just a place to get you started, and from there you can scale up. But that's a really great thing to just like remember, 1, 4, 5, 10. So you can do your mixing part really well, and you can sort of start to see with whatever flour that you're using, how your starter reacts with the time. This is like, that's like the baseline for experimentation. So from there you can adjust. This is sort of like almost like a 1.5 recipe, so like not enough for 2 full loaves like we're doing right now, but you'll end up with small loaves. But a really big recipe for 1 loaf. So I'm gonna put this away and show you yesterday's loaf and how big it came. Like, so it's basically the entire amount of bread that we made today, but in 1 loaf. Okay. I'm just putting it in my little basket. And you don't have to like stress yourself out about what, like you can use whatever you have around. The ideal thing is like you want it to be breathable. We haven't tested it in like a bowl, but I'm gonna do that next time I think, so we can experiment together. This is just like a plastic chip basket. So you can find this anywhere. It's only a few cents, probably even at the dollar store you can find this. So just whatever you have laying around, and then you want like a nice breathable linen cloth. Doesn't have to be linen, but just something a little more breathable. So I'm gonna stick this in the fridge. And just know that if you're splitting up the recipe, that might change your bake time. So we typically do 450 in a closed Dutch oven for 20 minutes and then 10 minutes open. But that is for 1 big loaf. I'll show you right now. Okay, so this is the full recipe. If you didn't split your loaves up into 2, this is what 1 looks like. And again, since it's so big, it like barely fit into that Dutch oven, especially because it's a circle and I shaped it as a batard, like an oval. So you get the like lines from your parchment paper. And once this cools down a little bit, later we can cut into it and take a peek at the inside. Okay, so this was our big overproof loaf. So for the recipe that we made today, this is the one I made yesterday that went a little bit farther than I wanted. So we're gonna cut into it and see how it turned out. It's still a little bit warm, so hopefully we didn't cut too early, but again, I'm impatient. This is why John always cuts my bread. Actually, turned out really great. It is still piping hot though, steaming out of there. So even though the loaf was popping out of the sides, we still caught it at a great time. If it was overproofed, we might end up with like a denser loaf with like a lot of big holes in it. We might have just been in a situation where the container that I had my loaf in was a little too small and didn't leave a lot of space for the expansion of for the like base size of our sourdough. Just goes to show you, there's a lot of variability with sourdough and sometimes the results will surprise you. Okay, so it's been about a little over 24 hours and I'm ready to bake this loaf and see how it turned out. So first things first, when I'm pulling it out of the fridge, I'm checking to see, did it grow in there? Because if it didn't grow, that would obviously indicate a problem. When we plopped this in here yesterday afternoon, it was smaller than the edges of this basket, so I know that it has expanded to take up the space. It's also a little bit taller. So I'm using my observation skills to, assess this. The other thing that I'm checking here is I'm gonna push into the dough and see, does it totally deflate if I press into it, or is it going to spring back? If it's sprung back like 100%, I know it's not ready. This one, when I touch it, it springs back like 90%, and so I know that there's some life in there. So we're just gonna plop this out, use some, I don't have any rice flour today, so I'm gonna use some regular flour to get some contrast on my loaf. The other good sign is that it's not sticking to the linen cloth that was in here yesterday. That felt a little bit overproofed. Turned out still nice. This one didn't stick at all. So we'll see how this one turns out. This is always the moment of truth. So I'm just gonna sprinkle some some regular flour on top. Get messy. This is what life's all about. And since we're doing a circle shape, we get a few more options here. So I'm gonna do like a classic X score. And because this is a younger loaf, I get the option to play. Lisa from Cottage Beach Bakery, I believe. She was somebody from California who visited us back in the days of the garage, and she was really great at scoring. And she taught me a little trick of tracing a line. So I'm not actually putting any pressure on my blade. I'm just tracing a line almost like you would be tracing in the sand, and I'm just holding it. So whatever I push on, it will just go without cutting into the dough, and using that line as my guide. So we'll just play. Just make a bunch of scores. Honestly, just let the dough speak to you. Follow your intuition. I like to do this little S score with my loaves, my bowls. I think they come out pretty cute. And with this, I'm just kind of going under the lip on each side. So I encourage an ear on both sides. And from here, just gonna get off all this extra flour. And we'll just plop that in our Dutch oven. The trick to this process is you want your vessel to be heated up. So we're gonna try to place this directly in the center here. And I'm gonna push down the parchment paper really carefully so I get less of those little paper wrinkles. We're gonna set this back in the oven and cover it with a lid to encourage that steam. Okay, so I've set 20 minutes on my timer. At the 20-minute mark, we'll see how it's doing. Hopefully by then it would have risen. And because it's a little bit smaller, I split the batch in two yesterday, and so this is gonna be like a smaller loaf. We might change the last, usually we bake for 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes on the second half, but we might actually change based on the size of the loaf and the heat in there, so we may lessen the time. Okay, here's the moment of truth. Woohoo! Expanded, and it's even starting to get a bit of color. So actually it's looking really good. I'm pretty pleased with this result. So we're gonna pop this back in the oven for another, I'm gonna say 10 minutes might be safe. We'll go like 8 minutes to be super safe without the lid this time. And there she is. Nice and golden. This isn't as dark as I normally bake, but this is also a very white sourdough. I'm overall very pleased with how it turned out. I was a little bit worried. It doesn't matter how long you've been baking, the moment before the bake is always like a moment. So I'm really glad that it turned out so beautiful. It puffed up really nicely. We did end up adding about 12 minutes after all. So that 8 that I originally estimated was a little bit early, but I'm glad I checked it because it's better to be safe than sorry. It's still a little bit hot, so I'm gonna wait a little bit before I pick it up and show you all what our final product is. Okay, I'm gonna pull it out of here. Looks like actually I did kind of push it. If you're baking at home and you want to just, double check, is your loaf done? Stick a thermometer in there. You're looking for 180 degrees Fahrenheit or above. But now that we have this beautiful specimen out here, once it cools, we can actually cut into it. But here's kind of what we ended up with. And I should have weighed this before we put it in, just to give you guys sort of a frame of reference about how heavy this loaf was or how many grams it was. I just kind of whipped it together and did it like I was baking at home. So I don't always measure when I'm at home. So just to go over like the timeline overview, if anybody needs that. Wednesday night, I refreshed my starter. Thursday morning, I mixed my bread. We let that dough sit out for about 4 hours in total between mixing and folding and bulk fermenting, and in the ambient heat, which it was a little bit warm yesterday, so I want to say 80, 85 degrees. And then we threw it we shaped our loaf and threw it in the fridge overnight. So for 24 hours from mix to bake. And then we baked our loaf, and here we have our final product. So this was yesterday's loaf, and you'll notice it's pretty tall in comparison. But this loaf was kind of over full for the banneton that I had rested it in the night before I baked it. Whereas this loaf, when we shaped it and put it into our banneton, you notice it was a small circle inside of a bigger circle. And so gravity's going to do its thing while it's puffing. We're not guiding it up. Rather, it guided itself out. It's going to take whatever space that exists. So instead of having a more plump, round loaf, we ended up with a little bit more flat, wide loaf. But it still did expand, and I'm very excited to cut into it. So this is our second loaf. Remember, I split the dough we had yesterday into 2. I probably could have got away with just keeping it as one, but since the loaf that I baked from the night before came out so big, I was a little bit worried about that being the case this time around. So I'm poking at it again, just trying to sort of see where it lands. It's still doing the same thing, which makes sense, same batch of dough. I did notice though, however, with this basket, even though there was a liner in there, it still kind of allowed for this drying out, so maybe something with a little bit less air holes is better. We use this, decorative basket to hold the round loaf in, and that seemed to do a lot better, which makes sense when we use bannetons in the bakery. They're made with wood, and they're breathable in that they have a little bit of this sort of weaving, but they don't have as many open holes like this. So that's just a little note, something I learned today too. And we'll go ahead and get ready to score it. And like I said, I usually like to use the rice flour just because if anybody does have any flour issues, with unfermented flour, this could kind of give them a little tummy ache, or give them adverse effects. Our intents and purposes, we're gonna do it like this. Again, when I was baking in the garage, I would let the dough just speak to me. Sometimes it took a minute to hear what it had to say. Sometimes I would like play with the rice flour on top of the loaf, and have it help inspire you to do something beautiful. This is by far the most fun part for me in the baking process, is getting to design something really beautiful on top of my loaf. These are like really baby loaves. And again, with this loaf too, in the basket that it was in and how small we had these loaves, it still decided to go out rather than up because our basket was a little bit too big, or both baskets were a little bit too big for the volume of dough that we had in there. All right. For good measure. I'm gonna go get my Dutch oven from the oven, and we'll get this one going too. Just pushing that paper down so I get less wrinkles. Okay, it's been about 20 minutes. We're gonna check and see how our loaf is coming along. All right, it expanded. Didn't get quite as much of an ear as I was hoping for. Neither did the smaller one either, but you know, we won't truly know where we landed until we really cut it open. But we'll stick this back for another 10 to 12 minutes. So we're gonna cut into our first loaf. It's been about 30 minutes or so since we baked it. It's warm, you can feel it's warm inside, but I can hold it and not burn myself. Nothing, sometimes, you know, I already said I was impatient, so we're gonna come in here and see how it turned out. Okay, this is what we got. I don't know that this is the best crumb I've ever gotten, but it's not the worst, and I'm glad that it's still opened, and smells great. And if I was baking at home, this would be a perfectly acceptable loaf. Like, you have to just pay attention to what you're doing and modify where you can. So in this case, you know, I noticed that my Banneton was maybe not the best. I should have trusted my gut in the beginning when we were mixing this, and that I felt that the dough or the mix was a little bit wet, and I should have probably just added just a touch more flour so that I could get the right consistency that I'm typically looking for. So it's just a combination of observing, adjusting, observing, adjusting, and just the repetition of practice. Sourdough is something awesome that you can do every single day. You can get into like a routine and a ritual of making sourdough. I really love it because, again, it's just such a grounding practice. You have to be in the moment. You have to be paying attention to your surroundings and all your senses. Just a reminder to also just slow down, because there's a lot going on in life, and being present is becoming a rarer and rarer thing. Always do this. That didn't work as planned. So the most important part of baking at home is to remember to just play. I mean, the essence of what you're doing here, it's a science experiment. You're always going to have different variables. The weather might be different, the humidity might be different, your energy going into the loaf might be different. Your flour might be different from batch to batch of flour bags. But ultimately, what are you creating at the end of the day? You're creating nourishment. It doesn't have to be beautiful. Sure, that's a bonus, but this will still feed me, provide me nutrients, provide my family nutrients. I have had, the most control that I can have over the ingredients going into this loaf, which makes me feel good. And I think that life is really all about, like, what do you do with what you've been given? How do you handle it? What beautiful thing can you make out of the constraints that you're working with? So this is not my best work, but I was dealing with a few variables here. One being, this is my first time doing this in this setting on camera. When I'm baking at home, I'm really honed in, but having to multitask between talking about what I'm doing and doing it has presented some challenges for me personally. Also, the flours, I had been feeding my starter with white flour and then moved to feeding it with a whole wheat flour, just because I ran out of the white flour that I had. And that also presented a new variable. Mixing on a hotter day than usual presented another variable. So like there's areas along the way that you can tweak, and eventually you'll learn how to ride the waves and like know really what you're looking for. It's just, don't forget the essence of what you're doing is it's play and experimentation and ultimately connection with what you're doing and what you're feeding yourself. And I'm a little bummed about that. Sourdough is a challenge. I think one of the biggest things that you'll have to overcome as a new baker is accepting these less than perfect results, being really mindful of how you speak to yourself in these moments. I think that sourdough baking in general, right, can be a great boost of confidence. But you have to kind of get over the hurdles and the reality that you can't control everything in life. And this is just like the perfect metaphor for that.